I grabbed my 5-year-old sister's hand and made a run for it. If we got caught, it'd all be over. We couldn't get sent over the border. We just couldn't. The sound of the dogs barking and the voices and the police officers grew louder with every second. We darted through the crowd until we came to a large drain. I jumped in first, then grabbed my sister and ran. The stench of the drain was nauseating, but we couldn't stop. We ran until everything was quiet in the dark. I sat and held Benita on top of me. When Mom had died, I'd promised her I'd take care of Benita. At this moment, I knew I needed to come up with a plan to protect my sister. This is my true story. However, names have been changed to protect the people involved.
Dev, I'm hungry.
Benny looked up at me. Don't worry, Benny, I'll get us something to eat. We walked along a dirty path. I saw lights ahead and I prayed that they were friends and not foes. A few minutes later, Benny and I stumbled into a refugee village. There were tents and boarded structures close to each other. I asked around for some food, but no one was willing to offer anything until I came to Arjuna and Anya's boarded structure. Anya opened the door and welcomed us into their 2-room home. She quickly made us some sandwiches with something to drink. After we thanked her, Benny and I gobbled them down. We had gone 2 days without eating. Thank you so much. My name is Dev and this is my sister, Benita. We're new here.
My name is Anya.
The door opened and she turned to the person that just came in.
And that's my older brother, Arjuna.
I stood up and shook Arjuna's hand. So what do you guys do for jobs?
There is a company that trains young men to be assistants to billionaires. It's nothing glamorous. We get less than minimum wage, but the income is steady.
How soon can I start training?
You can start tomorrow.
I'd need to get someone to watch Benny.
I'd love to watch her.
Anya offered.
You guys can stay here until you get on your feet. We don't have much, but someone helped us when we first started, so we're paying it forward.
The next day, I cleaned myself up and borrowed a suit from Arjuna. Training lasted 6 weeks where we learned how to answer phone calls, write shorthand, use a computer, practice basic sanitation methods, just to name a few. During those 6 weeks, I wasn't paid, so Benny and I depended on Arjuna's small salary to get by. I did some petty theft and handed the money to Anya to purchase food items. She never questioned where I got the money, and for that I'm grateful because I didn't want to lie to her. After my 6-week training, I was assigned my first billionaire. Over the years, I worked for quite a few billionaires, but they were all the same: mean, ungrateful, and selfish. I was able to put up a wooden structure next to Anya and Arjuna for Benny and I where we lived a very simple life. That was until I met Mr. Cook, who changed everything. During my first few weeks of working for Mr. Cook, who had a wife and 2 teenage daughters, it was a nightmare. I was expected to get to his home at 5 a.m., where I was instructed to iron Mr. Cook's suits and shine his shoes. I was also given domestic chores to complete as well. You'd think that if we were working in the same place, that Mr. Cook would have at least offered me a lift to the office, but that wasn't the case. I was expected to finish all my chores at his home and then travel to work and get there on time. But through it all, I smiled and I was always pleasant. If I had to suffer through a few injustices to give my sister a shot at a better life, then I was all for it. After the first 6 months, Mr. Cook called me to his office.
I must say, Dev, you are the best assistant I've ever had. You're diligent, hardworking, and not once have I heard you speak badly of me or my family.
Thank you, Mr. Cook.
I was just testing you to see if I can trust you with the lifestyle that I live and some secrets that must be kept between a boss and his assistant. Can you do that?
Yes, sir.
Good. I'll be setting up some computer courses and legal document classes so you're better equipped to fill in the gaps at the office when needed. You won't be getting a higher salary, but the experience will be good for you.
I kept my head down, did what I was told, and turned a blind eye to Mr. Cook's illegal affairs and late-night shenanigans with female workers. As the obedient assistant, I'd always call Mrs. Cook and let her know that her husband was in a meeting and he'd be home late. One afternoon, while Mr. Cook was out of the office, Mrs. Cook arrived. Good afternoon, Mrs. Cook. Mr. Cook is not in right now. Do you want to leave a message?
What I want is to see my husband.
You can wait in the waiting room until he comes, ma'am. Mrs. Cook laughed.
Do you really think I'm going to wait in the waiting room like a concubine?
Mrs. Cook walked to the door and tried to open it.
If you don't open this door right now, I'll make sure you never work in this town again, and you get deported to whatever godforsaken land you came from.
I opened the door quickly and Mrs. Cook entered and slammed the door behind her. I sat there nervously as I had strict instructions not to let anyone into Mr. Cook's office without his consent. As soon as I saw Mr. Cook walking towards his office, I walked hastily to greet him. Mr. Cook, I'm so sorry, I couldn't stop her.
Boy, stop babbling. Spit it out. Couldn't stop who?
Mrs. Cook, she's in your office, sir. Mr. Cook stopped and looked at me disapprovingly, but he didn't say anything.
Knock on the door in 5 minutes and say my next client is here.
I nodded and he inhaled deeply before he entered the office. For the next 5 minutes, I sat and listened to angry, muffled voices coming from inside Mr. Cook's office. As soon as the 5 minutes was up, I knocked on the door and opened it slightly. Excuse me, Mr. Cook, your next client is here.
Thank you, Dev. Margaret, we'll finish discussing this at home.
Mrs. Cook pushed past me and exited the office. Mr. Cook sat behind his desk and loosened his tie.
Pour me a scotch.
Yes, sir. After pouring the drink, I handed it to Mr. Cook, who drank it in one shot.
Okay, bring in the Phillip files. We have to get...
Mr. Cook's eyes widened as he held his chest. Mr. Cook, are you okay? Mr. Cook couldn't answer as he gasped for words. Somebody help! A few staff members gathered into the office and laid Mr. Cook on the floor and started CPR. But it was too late. Mr. Cook was dead. Staff members waited outside Mr. Cook's office for the police to arrive. I was taken to the police station and questioned. That's when I saw Mrs. Cook as she sat by another table with an officer as she gave her statement. I wasn't released until midnight, and I arrived to collect Benita around 1 a.m. I'm sorry I got here so late.
It's okay, Dev. We saw the news. Leave Benita to sleep. She'll be okay.
Anya smiled. I looked over at Arjuna. What's going to happen now? I've never had a billionaire die on me before. I ran my hands through my hair frustratedly.
I'm sure the company will line up another job for you soon.
I sure hope so, for Benita's sake. Over the next few days, I waited for a phone call from the company, but none came. I wondered if Mrs. Cook made good on her promise to ensure that I'd never work in this town again. On the news, it was stated that Mr. Cook had died of a heart attack, so I was no longer a suspect in Mr. Cook's death. Even though this was the case, the company never called to assign me a new job. I returned to the streets and pickpocketed people to ensure I was able to take care of Benita. One afternoon, while out in the streets, I got a phone call from Mr. Cook's lawyer. He wanted me to be at Mr. Cook's reading of the will. Arjuna, do you think I should go?
If you're invited, it means he left you something. Either way, it won't hurt to go and see what's up.
On the day of the reading of the will, I walked into Mr. Hudson's office waiting area. Mrs. Cook and her 2 daughters were there. A few seconds later, Mr. Finland entered.
Thank you all for coming.
What is he doing here?
Mrs. Cook scoffed.
He's here because he was invited. Shall we go to my office and begin?
He has no right to be here. What could Stan possibly have left for this low-life assistant?
Mrs. Cook raved on and on that I was just the help and I needed to go home and attend to my own affairs. I stood up and turned to Mr. Finland. I think I'd better leave. I don't belong here.
Dev, you stay right there. I'll read the necessary parts to Mrs. Cook and her daughters, then I'll come and get you, okay?
I nodded and Mr. Finland ushered Mrs. Cook and her daughters into the office. Approximately 30 minutes later, Mrs. Cook rushed into the waiting area and began to accuse me of swindling her husband. I don't know what you're talking about. Mrs. Cook stepped up and slapped me.
Security, get her and her daughters out of here now!
Yelled a voice from the door of the waiting area. After they were escorted from the building, Mr. Finland apologized to me. He also asked if I'd like to press charges against Mrs. Cook, but I told him I just wanted to get it over and done with, so he ushered me into his office. As I sat in the office and Mr. Finland read the will, tears came to my eyes. Mr. Cook had left me $10 billion. You're not joking, are you? Mr. Finland laughed.
Oh no, this is all legit. I guess you really made a mark on him. We also found documents where Mr. Cook was putting things into place so you'd have citizenship, and I'd like to finish the proceedings.
I nodded and gave Mr. Hudson all the information he needed so that I could receive the inheritance and the information needed to get citizenship. I have some friends. Can you help them with their citizenship as well?
Sure.
Mr. Hudson handed me his card.
Have them call me tomorrow so I can send all the paperwork in at the same time.
Over the next few weeks, Mr. Hudson helped us set up ID cards, bank accounts, birth papers, and citizenships. As soon as I received the inheritance, I gave Arjuna and Anya $1 billion. We purchased homes next to each other in suburban neighborhoods. We didn't want anything flashy to bring attention to ourselves. We were now able to enjoy our lives on our own terms. My story seemed to be a lucky one. Or was it? I have a confession to make. I was a computer hacker in my country. However, I knew I had to play possum if I wanted my plan to work. The goal was to get Mr. Cook to trust me, and once that goal was complete, I had everything else in the bag. Once trust was enabled, I had access to everything Mr. Cook had access to, things such as his medication, legal documents, and of course, a computer. With his heart condition, it was easy to switch his medication to one that would induce a heart attack, and with his constant use of alcohol, it sped up the process. Next, I gained access to Mr. Cook's will and made adjustments where necessary. It was easy to get Mr. Cook to sign his will since he signed documents without reading, because, yup, he trusted me. I also left citizenship documents in Mr. Cook's office drawer. After all, what harm could a refugee boy do to a billionaire? Mr. Cook was just like the others. He had everything going for him, but he chose to be arrogant and selfish. I was able to fulfill my promise to my parents, and now Benita and I have a life that we deserve. You can lose sleep over what happened to Mr. Cook, but I can assure you that I don't.
Okay, guys, look out below!
Roy, my oldest brother, grinned as he somersaulted off the boulder and into the lake below.
I don't know why she's here.
Mom's eyes bore into the back of my girlfriend of 3 years, Heidi, who was already in the water. Deal with it, Mom. I proposed, she said yes, so technically she's a part of the family. I ran towards the lake, not realizing that going into that lake would change my life forever. If you want to see how my life changed, keep watching. My story gets a bit crazy. You see, that's the last memory I ever had. This story is based off of everything in this notebook. That day, I swam around under the water and didn't realize how far out I ended up when I surfaced for air. The last thing I heard was the engine of a jet ski before I was knocked unconscious. I woke up a few hours later in a hospital bed. Where am I? I tried to focus my eyes on the objects in the room.
Thank God, Gregory, get the doctor!
Dad exclaimed. Dr. McPhee walked into the room and greeted everyone. While chatting with me, I noticed a concerned look on his face. What's the matter, Doc?
You have a concussion, which is usual for someone who has had a head injury.
Dr. McPhee walked out of the room and re-entered a few minutes later with a notebook and a pen.
Aaron, take this. I want you to start keeping a journal.
Why would he need to keep a journal?
Mom asked.
Because we aren't sure how extensive his injuries are yet, and we can only know this after a few days of observation.
I took Dr. McPhee's advice and jotted down a few notes in the notebook. Around 2 a.m., I flipped through the notebook and felt sick to my stomach as I read its content. I couldn't remember anything. I had amnesia, and my memory didn't retain information for more than a few hours a day. When my family arrived the next day, Dr. McPhee told them of his new findings. I was discharged a few days later. It was weird that I remembered everything up until the accident, but anything after, my brain rejected it. It was almost as if my brain was full and couldn't store any more information. With a lot of writing, I was able to understand my everyday life. It felt as though things were getting back to normal despite my lack of short-term memory. What is she doing here? I hissed at Mom as Heidi and my brothers stood a few feet away mingling at our annual family reunion. Mom smiled.
Who? Jasmine? I thought I'd invite her. I haven't seen her in a while and I wanted to catch up.
Mom walked away. Jasmine was my ex, the only girl Mom ever liked. During the night, I kept conversation light and didn't get into too many details about anything with anyone.
Are you doing okay?
Heidi smiled. So far so good, but I could be better. I kissed her.
Hey, lover boy, why don't you help your favorite aunt to bring out more drinks?
Heidi giggled. Sure, Auntie, I'm right behind you. As I entered the house to get the third case of drinks, Jasmine walked up to me and kissed me.
What are you doing?
Heidi's voice came from behind me.
We were kissing. What did it look like?
Jasmine looked at Heidi slyly. Heidi jumped on Jasmine and they began to fight. It wasn't long before some family members started to gather. Finally, Roy and I were able to separate them. Heidi and I left soon after. She told me she overheard Mom and Jasmine planning to break us up. I told Heidi that she was the only woman I wanted and she didn't have to worry. Later that week, a few college buddies came to hang out at my place. We'd just order a few pizzas as we'd discuss a new project they wanted me to lead since I was now unemployed due to my accident.
Okay, well, the guys and I were thinking that now is the best time to start our gym, and well, this will help you get back into the employment field as well,
Raul said. By the end of the night, we worked out which building would be best, the type of equipment needed, and the legal ramifications of things. They handed me a suitcase with $250,000 to get things started, since we wanted to purchase the property immediately.
And don't worry, we'll call in every day to make sure things stay on track.
James patted my back.
How about we grab a few drinks and then we'll call it a night?
Keston added. I agreed. I left the briefcase in my office and we left. I returned a few hours later and heard talking coming from my office. I pushed open the door. Mom and Heidi both turned in my direction. What are you guys doing in here?
I came over to drop off a casserole and I heard noises coming from your office. When I came in, I noticed this hooligan taking money from the briefcase. You are such a liar! I came over to spend some time with you, and I heard your mom on the phone. She said she needed the money to pay off the second mortgage.
Mom, did you take out a second mortgage?
Yes, but
Why?
after your dad did that eye surgery and was out of a job about 2 years ago, things were tough. But here you are, nothing but a disgusting, lying, two-timing. Aaron, you better put this tramp on a leash. How dare you allow her to speak to your mother in such a manner?
Heidi, please stop. This is my mother. There is a better...
You know what, Aaron? I'm sick and tired of you taking her side.
I watched as she removed the engagement ring from her finger and placed it on the table.
Now you and your mom can get married and live happily ever after.
Heidi stormed off. I was about to go after her when Mom stopped me.
Let her go, Aaron. It's for the best.
That night, I wrote about it in my notebook after Mom left, and I squeezed Heidi's engagement ring in my hand. Later, I decided to question Mom about the engagement ring. You see, I'd forgotten everything already, so I guess that's why Mom said,
Well, Aaron, Heidi stopped by last night. She told you that she found someone else, and you will never be enough for her.
After Mom left, I went to the office and read about what happened between Heidi and I the day before. Why would Mom lie? Why does she hate Heidi so much? I decided to pay Heidi a visit. As I approached her apartment door, I saw another guy coming out of her apartment. He kept his head down as he passed. I knocked on the door.
Patrick, did you forget something?
Heidi froze when she realized it was me and not Patrick.
Hi.
She folded her arms.
I didn't expect to see you here.
We need to talk about yesterday. May I come in? She stepped aside and I entered her apartment. Over the next few hours, Heidi and I had a long talk about our relationship, and she accepted the ring once again. I also promised her that I'd speak with my mother. As I promised, I spoke with Mom, and she agreed to give Heidi a chance. I suggested to Heidi that maybe Mom and my younger sister, Roxanne, help her with the wedding. At first, she was reluctant, but eventually she agreed. This seemed to be going well between Mom and Heidi, until one afternoon, Heidi called me angrily.
Your mother is a monster.
Wait, Heidi, what happened?
Your mom and Roxanne went with me to try on my wedding dress. I had to stop off at your apartment to collect my red purse. I decided to buy us some donuts from the cafe on the corner. When I returned, Roxanne was trying on my dress. My wedding dress. My dress is ruined. How could she?
Heidi began to cry. I told her to stay there. I was on my way. If I was a cartoon character, you'd see the steam coming out of my ears as I hopped into the car and drove home. A few minutes later, I unlocked the door to my apartment. Where's Heidi? Mom and Roxanne looked up from the TV.
She said she wasn't feeling well and went to lay down. We decided to keep her company until you arrived.
Roxanne babbled. I walked over to the TV, switched it off, and glared at Mom and Roxanne. Roxanne, she told me that you tried on her dress and ruined it. How could you try on her wedding dress? Roxanne tried to speak, but I silenced her. Whether you like it or not, Heidi and I are going to get married. I think it's time you both left. I walked to the apartment door and opened it. Mom and Roxanne exited without a word. During the rehearsal dinner a few weeks later, which was held in Roy's beautiful backyard under the tents, nothing went right. The cake samples for the wedding never showed up, and neither did the caterers. Roy suggested that we purchase Chinese food and use paper plates. Sometime during the night, someone lit one of the decorative plants inside the tent on fire. Luckily, we were able to get it under control before the entire tent burned. After that incident, I spoke with Roy and we decided to call it a night. The next evening, I called my family together at my parents' home. I told them I had an announcement to make. Once the family was gathered, I turned on the TV and played the DVD. The longer the video played, the tenser the atmosphere in the room became. The video showed Mom canceling the food and the cake, as well as setting fire to the plant. Once the video was over, Dad looked at Mom, shook his head, and walked out of the room. Roy suggested that he and the others leave so Mom and I could talk privately.
Aaron, I'm doing this for your own good. Heidi isn't who you think she is.
No, Mom, you're not the person I thought you were. I'm gonna marry Heidi, and there's nothing you or anyone in this family can do about it. I walked out of the house. I called Heidi, and we eloped that same evening. We decided to spend the night at my place, and the next day we'd look for a nice place to honeymoon. But my happily ever after ended before it could begin. By the time I woke up the next morning, Heidi was already gone, and with the remaining money from the briefcase. I checked my accounts. and everything I had was gone. That night, my parents dropped by to apologize, but when they saw me, they knew something was wrong, and I told them what happened.
I still have a few buddies at the police station. Let me give them a call and see if we can catch Heidi.
Dad exited the room to make the call. Mom sat next to me.
There was a reason I never liked Heidi. She was an intern at my job a few years ago. Rumor had it that she used men, and as soon as she got what she wanted, she'd leave. But you came to the office one day to drop off some paperwork for me, and she told me if I didn't introduce the both of you, that she'd make my life a living hell.
Mom inhaled deeply before she continued.
Heidi saw me and Mr. Ford in a very compromising position in his office one evening. She said she had pictures and videos, and she wasn't afraid to use them.
What? Mom and I spun around.
You and Mr. Ford had an affair?
Henry, it's not what you think.
Oh no, it's exactly what I think. You sacrificed our son so you wouldn't have to face the consequences of your actions. How much more selfish could you get?
Dad turned to me.
Aaron, I'm so sorry you have to go through this. I'll call you tomorrow, but for now, I need to get some air.
Dad walked out of the apartment, followed by Mom. A few days later, Heidi was caught with Patrick. Most of the money was still in the briefcase, so I was able to finish establishing the business with my friends. I got a divorce, and Mom and Dad are on rocky territory. And honestly, I don't know if their marriage will make it. As for me, I still use my notebooks to keep track of things. I wish things turned out differently. But hey, sometimes you have to use the lessons in life to make better choices in your future.
Some say I leave a trail of chaos behind wherever I go, but it's not true. Not for everyone. Fine, maybe some girls trip, spill coffee on themselves, or end up with a bowl of soup on their heads. But if they didn't want that to happen, they wouldn't flirt with my boyfriend. If you want more insane stories like this one, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it. Dating Flynn was difficult. Do you have any idea how hard it is to keep girls away from your boyfriend when he's so handsome and charming and funny and smart? Every girl around him became obsessed within minutes. I could tell by the look in their eyes. Even his family's obsessed with him. His mom texted him every single day like a psycho. I eavesdropped when they talked. Was she trying to introduce him to someone else? I always felt she was against our relationship.
Oh, you look so pretty in this dress,
said her mouth, but her eyes said the opposite. I hated going to visit Flynn's family. It was all hugs and kisses and questions. They kept asking when we were going to get engaged, or if we were planning on having kids. They just wanted me to hesitate so they could tell Flynn I wasn't serious about him. I could tell. Everyone was out to get me. That's exactly why I almost dropped the plates I was holding when I eavesdropped on Flynn talking to his mom before our anniversary.
Are you sure the house will be ready for Thursday?
He asked. In less than a second, I was putting the pieces together. Let's see. Our 2-year anniversary was on Thursday. The house is what he calls his childhood home. Something was missing, I thought. Before Flynn laughed and said,
"She's gonna love it."
Bingo. She had to be me. He wanted to spend our anniversary at his parents' house. I had to make him change his plans. Stat! First, I picked a really romantic movie about a couple taking a trip to watch that night. Why can't you be romantic like that? I asked him. I knew he was competitive, so that would get him going. Then I started leaving brochures for couples retreats all over our apartment. I found one of the brochures taped to the fridge with a little note that said, "Fine." Haha, I won! No anniversary at his parents' house. We picked a spa in the countryside for our anniversary. It was a few hours away, so we loaded our car with our bags and all sorts of snacks. I decided to drive because it had been my idea to go so far. A while after we left the city behind, the sky turned dark and Flynn started getting nervous. It was raining badly. Flynn kept drumming his fingers on the car door and scratching the back of his neck. I turned towards him and caressed the side of his face to calm him down. He gave me a little smile, but it faded and his face was lit up by headlights ahead. I managed to swerve right before we collided with a huge truck barreling towards us. The car bounced off the highway. Everything around me was spinning until the car crashed into a tree and we stopped. I turned to face Flynn immediately. My heart sank when I saw that he was unconscious, but he seemed fine aside from the ping-pong ball-sized bump on his head. I jumped out of the car and ran over to his side. I managed to pull him out of the car and set him down on the grass. My poor, handsome angel. He was out cold. There was nobody around for miles, but in the darkness, I could see the outline of a building. I managed to throw Flynn's limp body on my back and dragged him towards the building. I realized it was a huge barn. The doors were slightly open, so I pushed them and threw Flynn on a stack of hay. There were sacks of animal feed everywhere. They weighed a ton, but I dragged some around and arranged them into a makeshift mattress. Before I knew it, I was out cold too. I woke the next morning to a rooster's cry. God, for a second I thought the crash had been a nightmare. I remembered Flynn's condition and turned to face him, but I found him sitting a little further away from where I left him, looking at me with curious eyes. I leapt towards him and threw my arms around his neck. "Sweetie, you're okay. I was so worried," I said, touching the spot where the bump was almost gone. Flynn's eyes widened, and he looked really confused.
Who are you?
He asked softly. I backed up. "What do you mean, honey? I'm your girlfriend." I laughed. He's kidding, right? I thought.
Girlfriend?
He repeated as if it was the first time he was hearing that word. He looked down at his body, then at mine. He pointed at me and asked,
Why do you look like that?
"Did he forget who I am? Like, actually? Did he forget what I am?" "Flynn, honey, I'm a woman. I'm your girlfriend," I explained, holding his face in my hands. He said girlfriend again and smiled.
What does that mean?
He asked. I planted a kiss on his lips and smiled. "It means we can do that," I said. I knew he always loved kissing, so I wasn't surprised to see him grin from ear to ear from that. It was hard to get him off of me, but I had to go look for the car and grab our stuff. I could hardly believe it. My perfect boyfriend forgot who I am and what women are. So many possibilities swirled in my mind. No more competition. All I had to do was keep him in our little love barn. He would never see another woman, and I wouldn't have to worry for the rest of my life. After I grabbed a few bags of clothes and food from our wrecked car, I walked back to the barn whistling a tune. When I opened the barn, I dropped everything from my hands and gasped. "Flynn, who did this to you, honey?" I said as I ran to him. The love of my life was tied to a chair, and his mouth was taped shut.
Step away and put your hands where we can see them.
I heard someone yelling. I jumped away from Flynn and threw my hands in the air. I turned towards the barn doors and saw an old man holding a trident menacingly. A younger man next to him was swinging around some rope.
Want me to tie her up too, Pops?
He asked.
Nah,
Replied the old man.
y'all got till the cops show up to get off my property.
He grumbled at Flynn and me. The two men walked out of the barn towards a little house I could see in the distance. "Wait!" I yelled, running after them outside. I fell on my knees and begged them to let us stay. I explained that we were in an accident, but they didn't care. They didn't want a couple living in their barn. I had to do something. My perfect life alone with Flynn was crumbling. "We're siblings," I blurted out. "We're siblings. We're running away from our parents. They're psychotic," I cried. I managed to get tears to flow from my eyes, and the old man's expression changed.
Well, that's a different story.
He murmured.
Fine.
He said.
You can stay in the barn, but as long as you're here, you work to pay for your food and rent.
He said. I was so happy I wanted to kiss his muddy boots. I went back to Flynn and untied him. I explained the conversation to him.
I don't mind hard work as long as I'm with you.
He smiled, turning me into a puddle. We spent the rest of the day working on the farm. There was some old, dusty furniture stored in the barn, so we turned a corner of the barn into a living area. We even made a dining table out of crates. I went to the owner's house to grab the food we worked so hard for when I spotted a threat. Stepping out of a car was a stunning woman. She was built like a model. There were alarms going off in my head, but I had to feel her out before panicking. I approached her and introduced myself. Her smile almost melted my corneas.
I'm Samira. My dad owns this farm.
She said. She was all bubbly and pretty and sweet. Ugh, I hated her. I needed to keep Flynn away from her at all costs. He didn't know other women existed, let alone ones this stunning. I took the food back to the barn, shaking with nerves. What was I going to do if Flynn saw Samira? I found Flynn sitting at our makeshift table looking at something.
Babe, what's this?
He asked. What he was holding in his hands made my knees buckle. It was an engagement ring. He found it in his bag. So that means, before he lost his memory, I choked up when I explained to Flynn what that was. When I was having dinner with Flynn, I forgot all about Samara. It was just the two of us, as it always should be. I spent the next day desperately keeping Flynn and Samara from seeing each other. I smacked the back of Samara's horse when I was helping her out with it, so it galloped away with her on top before Flynn could see her. Then I threw chicken feed all over Flynn as Samara walked by, so all she saw was a cloud of chickens. I went to great lengths, so by the time I shut the doors to the barn that evening, I was exhausted. When I turned around, my exhaustion disappeared. Flynn had covered the barn in candles, set the table, and he was wearing the nicest out of the clothes he brought. I was awestruck. He was nervous all throughout dinner.
I did some research,
he said. He pulled the ring box out of his pocket.
I think this is the right moment.
He smiled, opening the box. The ring looked beautiful, glistening in the candlelight. My eyes filled up with tears.
Jenny, will you...
Flynn began, before he was cut off by a scream in the distance. He was startled and stood up instantly.
Someone's in danger!
He exclaimed before running out the doors. Seriously? Who's inconsiderate enough to start dying when I'm about to get engaged? I followed Flynn into the darkness. Soon enough, we found the problem, and my heart sank. Lit up by the moonlight was Samira, looking glorious sitting on a horse. The expression on Flynn's face broke my heart. He looked like he was seeing an angel.
Help!
Yelped Samara. I noticed her horse was surrounded by coyotes. Flynn reacted, grabbing a rake and swinging it at the coyotes, scaring them away. Flynn then extended his hand to help Samara off her horse. Every second their hands stayed touching each other, my temper rose even more. Before I knew it, I was seeing red. I couldn't control myself as I jumped Samara and knocked her to the ground. Next thing I knew, I was being pulled off from her by her father and brother. "You really like that rope, don't you?" I yelled at the owner's son as he tied me up. Soon enough, I was tied up in the back of a cop car. Personally, I think Samira overreacted by pressing charges. Now I'm stuck in county jail. Flynn comes to visit me every now and then, but I have a feeling Samira's making moves on my man. I can see them through the bars in my cell window after his visits. Why does she need to pick him up? Why does she need to linger when they hug? Why do they hug in the first place? I swear, the second I get out of here, I'm coming to get my man. And I'm getting close. My tunnel is almost done. You just wait, Samira. You don't know what I'm capable of. For Flynn, I'll do anything. I'll do anything. I'll do anything. I'll do anything.